Welcome to the Unknown broadcast. Indeed, the culture war continues unabated as social justice warriors take over college campuses, censor any views which may conflict with or challenge their asserted orthodoxy. They seem bewildered when I tell them I am so conservative that I cannot even turn left when I'm driving. This is broadcast number 36, and Dr. Jonathan Miles is going to join us to talk about the young and the Marxist. I can't even say it. The young and the Marxist. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of tonight's webcast. And here's Ronnie.
Here I am from sunny, humid, and wonderful Florida, where our sponsor for the entire evening will be World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop destination for half-baked heresies and other ideas whose time has long gone. World's End Theology Outlet. So how is everybody this evening?
Well, good so far. We had snow here 2 days ago. And
what's that? Oh, that stuff, yeah.
Yeah, the big white stuff. We had 5 inches of snow here. I had to shovel my driveway twice.
And it had nothing to do with politics or anything, right?
No, that's something else you have to shovel. No, it was kind of nice. In fact, since as those who are watching this may recall, Joy and I did over-the-road trucking for almost 7 years cross country, and I frequently did not have to worry about shoveling my driveway because we would be in California when they got the big snows here. But that was kind of nice, and we've also had the opportunity to do our own Christmas decorating this year, so it's been an enjoyable year. Dr. Jonathan Miles is one of our cohorts in rabble rousing here at Midwest Christian Outreach. He writes her blog and contributes to the journal.
I rouse some rabbles. I do.
He roused some rabbles, and he is a professor of philosophy. Jonathan, tell us where you teach at the moment, and a little bit about what attracted you to your profession, let's say.
Oh, to my profession. So I teach at Quincy University, which is a small school in Illinois, and what attracted me to my profession is I kind of came about this in a roundabout way. I started off in theology. I got a master's degree in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary, and it was the great Norm Geisler. I remember I should talk about it like he's in the past tense or something, but Norm, I went to Norm's office one day and I said, I noticed that in hermeneutics class we're debating these things, and some of these issues don't seem like they are really solved at the level of the text. They seem to be, there's something deeper here philosophically. And I knew Dr. Geisler had gotten his degree in philosophy, and I said, I feel like I ought to go and really dig into this philosophy stuff. I was getting close to finishing my master's degree, and he said, well, I think that's great. Where can I write you a letter of recommendation? And he was the one who sort of pointed me in the direction of philosophy, and I figured I'd go get a master's degree in philosophy, and then I'd come back. It'd make me a better theologian, right? And then somehow I developed this, I don't know, disease of questioning and burning questions about philosophical issues, and I realized that I could be a lot of service to God in this field as well as in theology. So.
Right, and it takes both. Now, tonight we're talking about what we have titled The Young and the Marxist, as I pointed out, kind of as our lead-in. We're watching on certain universities, at least, campuses, the students have now become the masters, the rulers of the university, rather than the officials who once guided the what would Rush Limbaugh call it, the mush minds of the young and trying to shape them. They have sort of taken their hands off and taken a step back, it seems like, to say, well, the students really know what's best for them, and so we will allow them to dictate policy and instruction and so forth, I think to the detriment. So why do we call this the young and the Marxist? Well, first, I think, Ron, I would like to ask him to give us a definition of Marxism so that we can see if we're even on the right page here.
Well, how do you begin with Marxism? You know, Woodrow Wilson said, never kill a man who's trying to commit suicide. You know, Marxism has committed suicide many times, and yet it just keeps coming back. It is the philosophy of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It sees the world through the lens of class struggle. The history of the world is the history of class struggle, is, I believe, one of their most quoted lines. Everything is interpreted in terms of who is on top and who is being oppressed down on the bottom. And according to Marx, eventually it is inevitable that society will evolve into communism. And for Marx, communism was a step beyond socialism. You have to get to it by revolution. And every phase of human history prepares for the next phase. He borrowed the idea, which is usually attributed to George Friedrich Hegel, but a lot of Hegelians dispute that it was really his idea of, it's called thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And the way it goes, in Hegel, it's often misunderstood. Hegel believed that every state of being has internal contradictions. So during the feudal era, where you had feudal lords and serfs and all that, there were internal contradictions that inevitably led to the rise of the merchant class, the bourgeoisie. And the bourgeoisie, that whole era had internal contradictions that eventually led to the Industrial Revolution. And in his mind, what was going to happen was the next step was going to be socialism, where the workers would rise up and they would demand and get the means of production. The workers he called the proletariat. For a while there would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, but because of the internal contradictions of that state of being, eventually it would evolve into pure communism. And in pure communism, it's every middle schooler's dream. I mean, when I taught middle school, I had one student who was, she said, why do we even need money? Why can't people just go and get what they want and take it home? And I said, well, you're describing pure communism. And she goes, so? I mean, isn't that the way it's supposed to be? Why all this emphasis on money, money, money? Well, in pure communism, you go to work and you produce things, and then you go home. You don't get a paycheck. You don't own anything. Let's say you work at a factory that makes chairs. People come to your factory and take the chairs they need from everyone according to their ability. That's you. You're the chair maker. You know how to make chairs. To everyone according to their need. People come to you and they get their chairs from you. It's a cash-free society. I already live in a cash-free society, by the way. I've beaten Marx to that. I'm cash-free right now.
If you want, right now. Okay. If I can interrupt here, whenever I try to explain the idea of a cash-free society in terms of a Marxist utopia, I just tend to play episodes of Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yep.
The replicator on Star Trek produces all of the goods that one needs. We don't have to work for anything. You just walk over to the replicator and it produces it, whatever it is that you want. There's no need for money of any kind. And look how peaceful it is, except for the Borg, who are a problem, and occasionally the Klingon or the Romulan. You really the Federation is a Marxist utopia.
And even in one of the episodes, they never come out and say this, but I forget whether it was an episode or a movie. Captain Picard says the economics of the 24th century are a bit different from what you're used to. And, I mean, come on, it's pretty obvious what he's saying.
Okay, so a short version of this, just for the consummate layman, that would be me, because you're kind of our two resident smart guys. The consummate layman, so that others who may be watching this can understand, this is really where we get the whole concept of social justice, quote unquote. This sort of comes out of Marxism, is the idea that life ought to be perfect. Life is unfair at the moment, but is unfair because the rich are getting rich on the backs of the poor. And so in order to have a socially just society, we need to make sure that everyone has equal outcomes, not just equal opportunities. Would that be correct?
Yeah, as Winston Churchill said, the chief vice of capitalism is the unequal distribution of blessings. The chief virtue of socialism is the equal distribution of miseries. And nowhere can this be seen more clearly than in Cuba. You just go there and you have the equal distribution of miseries, except if you're part of the communist upper elite class, you get good health care. You get what Michael Moore saw when he came to view the spectacular Cuban medical system. He saw what the international clientele of Cuba gets to sample, but the average person, where they go for medical care, they reuse the plastic gloves and hang them out to dry.
Well, and the thing is that the idea that one could centrally plan a society, right? The idea that we could tweak society in such a way as to create this progressive dream is what F.A. Hayek called the fatal conceit. Right?
Now, who's this F.A. Hayek guy?
It was a conceit, and it was fatal.
Right. So, Ron asked a good question. Who's F.A. Hayek?
Yeah.
So,
I don't think...
Friedrich Hayek was an Austrian economist.
Right.
And he disparaged the idea that one could centrally plan an economy, right? And he has an essay called "The Mirage of Social Justice," where he claims that social justice itself is a kind of, if we mean it in the sense of sort of trying to tweak the structures of society in order to produce a certain kind of outcome, that this is not only subject to the law of unintended consequences, but it is also incredibly dangerous because it will inevitably tempt people towards tyranny.
And he also wrote a book about serfdom. What was it called again?
The Road to Serfdom.
The Road to Serfdom. Yeah, I think he was part of that Austrian School of Economics that eventually became the Chicago School of Economics. The libertarians in our country, Thomas Sowell would be one of the last vanguards of that school. And so Milton Friedman was the go-to guy for the 60s, 70s, 80s. The biggest setback for the Chicago School of Economics was the 2008, 2009 market implosion. And the reason I say that is because Alan Greenspan was the heir apparent of the Chicago School, and he was caught off guard by it, and he made some remarks that kind of revealed some of the problems. He said he really felt that the market forces would not have acted against their own best interests the way they did in that disaster. And so probably that particular viewpoint is going through some tweaking right now. How much regulation do we need or don't we need? That's about it. I would call that tweaking. But in a Marxist system, really, the social justice is based on the idea that anybody who is, on top, anybody who you cannot have more of anything without taking away from somebody else.
Right.
Everybody.
So if we were to think about it in terms of a product, let's say a pie.
Right, a pie.
The assumption is that there's a single pie that is of one size, and so in order to have more of that pie, you have to take it from someone else who will therefore have less. But economically, from a capitalistic standpoint, the pie expands or shrinks, or you make more pies, and so you might introduce a product, let's say like Apple computer, creates an entirely new industry, which generates more income because you have more people working, and so now the pie is no longer just one size. Would that be
the short answer is that the economy is not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Right. So, back in the 70s, I have a friend who was taking an economics class at Florida State, and his professor would draw the typical pie graph on the board and say, okay, the United States has 5% of the world's population, but it consumes 20% of the world's resources. This is just plain wrong. And my friend would say, well, why can't we just make the pie bigger so that we can, so that there'll be more for everybody to go around? I mean, we can do more exploration for resources. We can fire up other countries' economies so that they, are able to do more as we are. But they didn't think in those terms. And there is this emphasis on finitude, that we're always on the verge of running out of something dire, something critical. We're always, and that goes back to Thomas Malthus, who believed that eventually the world's population was going to outstrip its ability to support it. So the Malthusian, hysterics and gloom and doom, we still have it today. I was raised to believe that we were going through this thing called a population explosion, and by the end of the 20th century, it would be like Soylent Green, on the movie, and we would only have, so much elbow room, and we wouldn't be able to move around, and people would be starving to death because we were overpopulating. Well, by 1973, the United States was at zero population growth. Now, that wasn't necessarily for good reasons, but abortion was
or a good end. Now, I want to move along because the three of us could sort of get trapped in all of the nuance of how we got here and that sort of thing. I want to move along to the question of what we're seeing on college campuses with what we've talked about sort of as a backdrop. Dr. Jonathan Haidt, Haidt, has done a really interesting talk, which we have linked to on our Facebook and our emails and blogs for the last few weeks, because I think it's a very important piece talking about social justice university versus truth university and what's going on from his perspective. Jonathan and I have talked a lot about this as we have watched kind of the meltdown on the university campuses in what some of the press has dubbed the snowflakes.
The buttercups.
The buttercups, who seem to no longer know that there's actually a difference in genders that is provable. Now you are whatever you feel like you are. And if someone says, okay, yes, you look like a 64-year-old white male about 5'8", that's what you look like, but you really, because you feel like you're a 6-year-old female from China, that's really what you are, and we should just let you self-identify as that and treat you in that way. And if we don't, then we're being mean. And so there's a meltdown on that.
Oh, you're being oppressive.
Or are you being oppressive?
Right.
We need safe spaces because, after all, we have heard ideas that conflict with what we already believe, and we don't know how to handle that. And so we need to have a place where we can hide away from thoughts that may challenge our thinking because they could make us feel bad. Jonathan, can you kind of step up to the plate and tell us what is going on from a perspective of a university professor as you're watching this?
Yeah, so I think what you have is you have a generation of students who are very disillusioned about the nature of democracy. Jonathan Haidt, you mentioned him just recently. I frequently watch his Twitter feed, and he just posted that the people who think that it is necessary that we live in a democracy or a democratic republic, any kind of representational democracy, is at an all-time low and will probably go lower. So it's a scary time because people don't have any faith, especially the youngest generation, don't have any faith in the institutions of democracy. Okay? And they think the system is rigged, right? And so you couple that with a very strong sense of what I call naive relativism, right? The idea that there are no moral absolutes at all. Then if there are no moral absolutes that we can talk about, then what's left is, well, really an absolute, but there is the idea of power, who's in power and who isn't in power. And in fact, there was a guy named Stanley Fish who wrote a paper once called, an essay called "There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too." And he was rather prescient in that. I don't remember exactly the year that it was written, but what Fish said was that nobody has ever allowed free speech completely. We all make exceptions to free speech, even
so
if
you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, for example.
You can't incite a riot based on false information like that, or something along those lines. So then he said, well, then what is it? And he likes to point out that even our strongest supporters of free speech from classical antiquity, like John Milton, who wrote the Areopagitica, was all in favor of, allowing free speech, except for those papists, right? No Catholics. And John Stuart Mill, who I have spent a great deal of time studying, made lots of exceptions to free speech. He really did. And so what Stanley Fish said was, look, there's no such thing as free speech. So what is left is a political power. Like, people will gain the moral high ground by talking about free speech and expression and these sorts of things. And it's just a way of politically maneuvering your position. Now, he was concerned about this. He was really kind of worried about this. He took a very moderate view that we could get over this or whatever. But I think what you found within things like critical race theory and some of the other views that are out there is that they have taken Fish's position that since there are no absolutes and there's no such thing as free speech, and said then speech is really about power. And that means if it's really about power, the people who don't have the power, according to them, should be able to speak, and the people who do have the power, the sort of the ingrained establishment or whatever, should shut up. Right?
Well, the thing is, as I see these kinds of things happening, you run across this also with people who will say, I once watched an interview on Sunday morning television, a religious broadcaster, a liberal denomination had its religion program on. And they were interviewing a fellow who was going to the United Nations and to other nations to get them to pass laws to license journalists. You need to have a journalist license, in his opinion. And why did you need to have one? Well, because there really is no such thing as freedom of the press. Why is there no such thing as freedom of the press? Well, because, well, look at all the media outlets that we get our information from. They're all controlled by big business and corporate sponsors, and therefore they're not free. Well, what's going on here is people are playing games with words. Freedom of the press has never, ever been defined as saying anything without consequence. Freedom of speech has never been defined as saying anything without consequence, freedom of the press, and so on. It's always been defined, however, as you cannot restrain somebody from saying it before they're going to say it. We call it prior restraint in this country.
John Stuart Mill has he lays out his idea of free speech by saying the following. He says, there ought to be unregulated sentiment and opinion. And any society in which opinion and sentiment is regulated is not as free. Okay? So the key idea here is not every action, and it's not even everything that we say. We can do lots of things with words other than engage in opinion and sentiment, right? I mean, Don here has done something with words other than express an opinion. He's married people before, haven't you, Don?
I have.
Like married people?
Yeah.
You pronounce some words, right?
I do.
Yeah, and those words are not just an opinion; they carry authority with them, right?
Correct.
There's in some ways a kind of action. So we can do lots of things with words. We can threaten with words. We can marry people with words. We can do lots of things with words. But opinion and sentiment is the thing that Mill wanted to be free, right? So I can't say anything anywhere because in certain contexts, the same words become the same opinion or sentiment becomes something else. So Mill gives an example. He says, he takes a phrase, corn dealers are starvers of the poor. Corn dealers were vegetable speculators. They were speculators in commodities, right? And there was a popular sentiment in England at the time that those people who speculated in the prices of commodities were causing the prices of commodities to go sky high, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you said corn dealers were starvers of the poor, that would be the equivalent today of saying, the 1% are starving the 99%, right? That was the term. Mill said if that statement were published in a newspaper, or in our days, if it was tweeted or put on Facebook, it should enjoy absolutely no regulation. However, if that same statement were stated outside of a corn dealer's house where people had gathered to protest, it could leave the realm of free speech and enter the realm of action. And he says nobody pretends that action is as free as speech. So notice,
okay, so
content
if you're outside and it could become action, are you saying that the speech could lead to someone burning his house down?
Well, notice, even if I published it in the newspaper, it could lead to his house being burned down, right?
Right.
Okay. So it can't be that it's the outcome or the result, which is unusual for Mill, who's a consequentialist. He thinks that the right thing to do is dictated by its consequences. But on this, he says, even if it results in the same sort of events, it should still remain free. It's something about the context itself, not the results, not the outcome, But if I were to make this speech, if I were to say corn dealers are starvers of the poor in front of this guy's house, it leaves the realm of free speech and becomes almost a kind of incitement that we don't have when it's published in the newspaper.
So that's Mill's definition of freedom, right? Now, would he be against penalties for things like inciting riots, or would he be in favor of that?
No, he would definitely say that those persons could either be prior restraint. In other words,
okay,
you could, before it really got going, you could come and disperse the crowd or whatever. And also, if afterwards this happened, you could actually then prosecute this person. Now, there is one caveat. Mill would say that would be permissible. He doesn't necessarily say that we ought to do that, because then he would fall back to the idea that if prosecuting this person or these persons would end up making things worse for everyone, then we shouldn't do it.
Okay, we're gonna prosecute someone here momentarily. Ron has a word from our sponsors,
Yes,
so we're gonna see who we can offend.
Yeah, that's, our sponsors are the nicest, sweetest people in the entire world, and they just want what's best for you. Not that they would ever dictate any ideas to you or help you dictate your ideas to anyone else, but our friends at World's End Theology Outlet have something very special for this holiday season. So you know what? You've gotten the puppies. You went out and you got those puppies. You went out and got the blankets and the pillows, and you got the coloring books, but something is still missing. You just don't feel safe. I mean, what can we do to help you have a safe space? Well, World's End Theology Outlet, just in time for the holiday seasons, has provided instant safe space. This is a unique product. It's only available through World's End Theology Outlet. It provides guaranteed protection from trigger words, cognitive dissonance, and unwelcome thoughts. Look, you want to feel protected. You want to feel safe. You need instant safe space. It's available this week at World's End Theology Outlet. Well, I hope you take advantage of that very special offer.
I actually have several rolls in different colors of safe space.
Instant safe space, right? It's not about imposing our wills on other people. It's just about keeping them from not letting us feel safe. I really agree with this. In any case, look back on what you said about Stanley Fish and about and the person who wanted to impose journalism licenses. You need permission to be a journalist. Basically, he's saying, Stanley's one of his premises was there is no freedom of speech. One of the main premise of this other fellow I was telling about is there is no freedom of the press. And what they're doing is they're following a Marxist methodology. This is to get this back to Marxism. Marxism believes there are inherent contradictions and inherent oppressions within the system. And so Marxist people with that mentality spend an inordinate amount of time looking for them and trying to flip the narrative. When the Berlin Wall fell, I had a friend who was a Marxist, and I said to him, things aren't going your way, are they? His name was Juan. He was from Puerto Rico, and he was definitely a Marxist. And I said, well, one good thing that's going to come out of this is freedom is going to come to the Soviet Union. He looked at me and says, you think you are free? You are not free. You are not free. It's like, okay, tell me how I'm not free. Well, then it dawned on me. I was still kind of getting my bearings and all of this ideology stuff. We moved down to Florida, and not far from our house, there is a park, a children's park. It's called Four Freedoms Park. And I always wonder, why is it called Four Freedoms Park? Well, that's because back during the Second World War, our beloved president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, gave a speech in which he said that there are 4 freedoms that that every person in the world should have. Now, 2 of them we already agreed with. He listed freedom of speech and freedom of worship. But then he went on to identify 2 more: freedom from want, which had never been part of our democratic Republican system. The government is going to guarantee that you are not in lack of any basic needs, and freedom from fear. Okay, so now we're protecting people from feeling what? Unsafe. Okay, this goes back to Franklin Roosevelt.
Wow.
And how much power can the government have to keep people from never being in want and never? Well, the only way they can do this is if they have you under their control. That's really the only way. Let's say I want to take a risk. Let's say I want to go on a hike in the backwoods of Alaska, as one young man did about 15, 20 years ago. I forget how long ago it's been now. It's been a long time. He was an adventurer. Unfortunately for him, he found himself in the middle of nowhere with no food, only his camera. And he starved to death. And he took pictures of his life chronicling the end of his days. He'd taken a risk, and he'd lost the risk. He'd lost the gamble. His parents, though, knew him very well, and they knew that he died doing what he loved, taking risks, going out into the wilderness, being on his own, fending for himself. He just happened to get a little bit too far away from any food source, and it didn't go well. The government, to keep you from exposing yourself unnecessarily to such risks, the government would just say, well, you just can't go there. You just can't go to Alaska. You can't fulfill that part of your nature. It's not really part of your nature anyways. And we don't want your parents to be afraid that you're going to starve to death, so we have to protect their freedom from fear.
Okay, so this mentality then,
are you talking about?
We could track it back a long ways, but it's really manifesting itself in today's college students in a way that we haven't really seen before.
Yeah, I was going to add, one of the things, so I'm going to put one more piece to this puzzle. There was a time when incitement was an exception to free speech. If you incite someone to violence, if I whip up a crowd and they burn my house or burn your house, then that's what we would call incitement to violence, right? And there's always been exceptions to free speech for that.
Mm-hmm.
However, starting in the early 1960s and early 1970s, a lot of countries in Europe, especially Australia in 1977, Germany after World War II, put provisions in their constitutions for incitement to hatred and violence.
Mm.
So notice the difference between inciting someone to hate and inciting someone to violence. If I incite you to engage in violence, right, I sort of, maybe I overcome your emotional, and I sort of whip you up as a crowd, and you storm the gates of somebody's house or something like that. If I incite you to hatred, I can cause, I sort of change your mind to adopt a sort of disrespect or despising of this particular view or whatever. Well, that could occur, weeks or months before the event, right? And so you get something like the pastor in Sweden, Ake Green, who gives this sermon about homosexuality, and he spends a month in jail. Why? Because it violated the incitement to hatred. Right? Not the incitement to violence. As far as we know, nobody got hurt as a result of them going out and doing something in the right after his sermon or during his sermon. Nobody started beating up on gay people. But hatred, on the other hand,
we kind of see this working itself out politically as we talk about, for example, the whole question of illegal aliens redefined as undocumented, undocumented whatever they are now.
Undocumented, yeah.
Undocumented citizens.
Yeah.
Undocumented
I've actually
citizens.
heard them called undocumented citizens.
Yeah, so it's redefined. Why? Because to say they are illegal aliens incites hatred, and we have to not do that. Or Muslims, there's a question of, if we just allow Muslims to come in sort of unchecked, how many of them will be terrorists? It's not a question of should someone come in if they're a Muslim or not a Muslim, but should we somehow try to protect U.S. citizens from terrorists? That's the question. Well, it's changed by those on the left to say, by being anti-terrorism, you are now anti-religion, you are racist in some way, and you are inciting hatred based on a religious view.
Right. I mean, you can make a case against the idea of clamping down on immigration without necessarily being hateful towards a religion, right?
Right.
You can make an argument for clamping down on immigration without necessarily being hateful towards a particular religion. But I will agree with you that there is a kind of co-opting of words here. I will agree with that. That's the reason why I don't like the way that social justice has been co-opted. As a philosopher, I take offense to the idea that justice is simply a matter of power and how you get it. For 2,500 years, philosophers have been talking about what justice is as fairness. That's a good basic idea. Justice is fairness. Now, we could debate about how we ought to get that fairness and that sort of thing. But I resent the idea that we simply take the term social justice of society, social justice, and we've now filled it full of a particular set of baggage.
Right.
I
think
resent that as a philosopher.
I think the primary word that's been co-opted in this discussion, and it's been going on for quite a while, generations even, is the word equality. And really, we've had some pretty interesting disagreements on the meaning of that word, going all the way back to our founding fathers. If John Adams had written the Declaration of Independence as originally planned, would he have included the phrase "all men are created equal," or the clause? And the chances are no, he wouldn't have, because there was a genuine disagreement on what that means. Even what is John Adams would have said, yeah, everyone's equal before the law. There should be no discrimination between two individuals based on their rank in society when it comes to justice. But in every other way, people would be, in many other ways at least, people can be unequal. They can be unequal economically, they can be unequal intellectually, they can be unequal in multiple ways. And what Marxism and its other similar philosophies try to do is absolutize the concept of equality. It's really the equality is the premise, is the foundation. Their notion of equality is the foundation on which their notion of social justice rests. We have to level you keep on hearing phrases. We have to level the playing field. We have to make this fair for everybody. We have to have universal access to whatever it is we're talking about at the time. It's not going to be fair that only billionaires get to go to the moon. It's why shouldn't everybody be able to take SpaceX or whatever is on its now that of course sounds ridiculous today, but we haven't wait for 50 to 100 years. There was when we had the Occupy Wall Street, and they were in, I forget the name of the park now that they ended up occupying. One of the liberal-leaning comedy shows. I think it might have been Jon Stewart's show or something, which this surprised me because they went in there with a microphone, they interviewed, and they found two fascinating things. Number one, this community in the park had divided into two polarized regions, and you could quickly see that one was the haves and the other was the have-nots. You had a kind of an upscale end of the park where they drank lattes, and then you had this kind of downscale area where people were more kind of blue collar. And then they did an interview with this one gentleman who was holding an iPad, and he was marveling over it, and they were still relatively new at the time. And he says, everybody should have one of these. Everybody, you know, and the interviewer says, oh, well, can we give them yours? And no, you can't give them mine.
Yeah, he said, I don't believe in, we believe everything should be public. You know, he was trying to sort of spout off the manifesto, right? And everything should be public, and we don't believe in private property. And he said, okay, well then I'll just take your iPad. And he said, no, I believe in personal property, just not private property. What he meant by that was, I believe in individual property, not corporate property. You know, it's as long as you, if it's my iPad, I want to keep it. If I want to start making iPads, that's the problem.
Well, which means that nobody will ever get an iPad if you have your way.
Yeah, that's right.
So, is it the educational system? Is it
yes?
Is it,
Yes.
The cultural shifts that have occurred, maybe because of the educational system? Is it somehow the lack of biblical influence on culture?
Yes.
That's kind of destroying critical thinking abilities. You know, what do you think is going on here?
Okay, so I think it's a combination of a few things. Like I said, I think that you have a kind of naive relativism. The naive relativism that says there is only one rule, one absolute rule, and that is thou shalt not judge. That then gets hardwired as thou shalt not judge me, right? I see it in classrooms all the time. You have students who will say, well, you know, who's to say what is right or wrong? And then I sort of point out some things that they believe in very, very, very strongly. And they say, well, you know, there's those things, right? The things that we don't have to, we don't have to debate about anymore, like slavery or whatever. Those issues are over. And I just want to point out, you can't have your relativist cake and eat it too. You got to have both, right? So number one is you've got this real lack of moral reasoning, right? We don't know how to reason to any kind of moral absolutes at all, any kind of moral principles. So what fills the gap when you don't have any kind of absolute moral principles? The idea of power. Whoever's in power shouldn't be, right? Unless it's me. So you get tribal kind of ideas, right? And so there's my tribe and there's all the other tribes. And there's a lot of social psychology literature that indicates that we have a tendency to give a pass to the people in our tribe and not a pass to everyone else. And once you do that, you couple the relativism with the idea that power is the only thing that matters, right? The class struggle that Ron talked about, all right? Then you add in the idea that there is no such thing as truth, right? There is only who can scream the loudest. And you start getting ideas like people shouting down people in the middle of their talks instead of engaging with them afterwards in the Q&A. You get the example that happened in Berkeley University 2 weeks ago, where the LGBT students and one of the other campus groups blocked off the way to get to classes. This big old long wall of people and their demands were that they wanted a new place for LGBT students to congregate, and they wanted more facilities for people of color. the idea was we don't have the same amount of power you do. We want more power. So we block off this gate, right? And then they allowed people of color to pass through. White people had to go around. White people had to go down an embankment, across a creek, and back up the other side. I got pictures of it, right? And the idea was, you've had your power, right? As one person said, look, I'm just trying to get to class. I support you guys. Great, wonderful. Can I please get to class? And there's video of this guy going, this isn't about you. This is about whiteness, right? The problem is that you don't understand that you're part of the privileged class, and you're just going to have to take your lumps like everybody else in the privileged class.
Okay, so in order to resolve this, what we need to do is reinstitute segregation.
Right.
We need spaces for blacks, spaces for gays, separate from...
But no spaces for white. No spaces for white.
No spaces for whites.
Yeah,
segregated from somebody else. So we have to reinstitute segregation as a good thing now. We used to think segregation was a bad thing, but now it's a good thing.
I'm going to actually go to further. I'm going to say that the so-called alt-right, which wants a white separatist movement, so people like Richard Spencer and the people that you've heard about on the news lately, and some of the people that are involved in some of these racial groups like Black Lives Matter and
Right.
ACT UP and all these sort of things, have more in common and more respect for each other.
Right.
Right? I mean, you go all the way back to the early 1900s. One of the most important Supreme Court cases was a guy was called Beauharnais v. Illinois. There's a guy from an organization, Joseph Beauharnais, from the White Circle Council, which was a white separatist group, started passing out literature in downtown Chicago. And at the very top of it, it said, we are not against black people. We are for white people, right? I'm suggesting that kind of separatism, like African-American groups or Latino groups wanting their own separate dorm at school and all of these sorts of things, are the natural progression of that kind of idea. And even further, I'm suggesting that they have more in common with white supremacists than they would ever be comfortable with.
Well, sure. You and I have talked about this in private. David Duke and Louis Farrakhan have far more in common with each other than, say, David Duke does with, I don't know, pick a white guy, any white guy, conservative. And Louis Farrakhan has more in common with David Duke than he does with Ben Carson, for example.
Yeah. It's interesting when on YouTube, you can look it up. There's an interview with Muhammad Ali back in the, I don't know, late 60s, early 70s, in which he was arguing against interracial marriage and arguing very strongly for what sounded like very, you think you're listening to a KKK speaker. He wasn't, being, he wasn't being vociferous. He wasn't being, Muhammad Ali could be very, he could project a lot of emotion. He was actually being very rational and talking this out with people who were pretty astounded to hear these words coming out of his mouth. There's a fine line between protecting minorities from oppression and the dictatorship of minorities. I think that's what we're finding out, where you have these incidences where minorities gang up on white people and tell them you can't go here because we're so oppressed. And we're trying to free ourselves from your oppression. And the only way we know how to do it is to oppress you.
Okay. I have another question, because this has to do with exercising rights, by the way. You were talking, Jonathan, about this line blocking students off from being able to get to their classes.
Yeah.
In the name of, really in the name of segregation, but in class struggle or whatever. We have watched as college students who were having emotional meltdowns because Hillary didn't win this election, blocking off interstate highways.
Yeah.
and thereby impeding the progress of others who were on their way to work, on trips, on the way to hospitals, and that sort of thing. Does one individual or group's rights give them the permission to violate the rights of others in the process of protesting?
So no, it doesn't. And let me tell a story. So I just spoke just recently at Texas Christian University, and I spoke on the peculiar evil of censorship. And so before I left to go to Texas, one of my classes asked me to give my talk to them. And I said, well, I'd love to practice it on somebody, so I'll practice it on you guys. So I showed them the picture of the protest at the gate at Berkeley. And I asked, is force being used here by the protesters? Are they engaging in coercion? We had talked about what coercion was and this sort of thing. And I said, is coercion being used here? Because these white students, and I showed them a picture of the white students having to go down the embankment and across the river and back up on the other side and go around. And at first they were like, well, yeah, there's coercion being used. And I said, okay, now normally we don't allow coercion of people. We don't use force against someone unless they're harming others, unless those people are harming others. And we normally don't allow people to harm others in this kind of way. And I said, so if these people are forcing the white people to walk around, they're using force and they're harming them. Is that okay? And they knew where this was going, because normally when I bring in the idea of harm, you see, one of the major ideas within a progressive society is the idea that you shouldn't harm anybody else, right? I shouldn't harm you with my words. You shouldn't harm me with your oppression, all this sort of stuff. So I said, are these students being harmed? Well, their culture. I said, I'm not asking about their culture. I'm asking about them. Are they being harmed? And the response was, yeah, they're being forced and they're being harmed, but it's for a greater good. I said, okay, now we have a debate here, all right? Because this isn't a debate about rights, because they don't have a right to block the gate. They don't have the right to use force. And that's exactly what they're doing. And then a few of the students who were very uncomfortable with this discussion tried to describe it in terms of, well, it wasn't really force. And I said, how is it not force? They have to walk, out of their way because of this particular protest. There are other ways that they could get their point across. Probably would be better to go, and talk to the administration or something along those lines. And their conclusion was that it was necessary force. And I said, why is it necessary force? And their response was, because the outcome is right. And I said, really? How do you know the outcome is right? It just is.
Because I feel it's right. Yeah. See, that's a problem. Now we're gonna take another commercial break quickly here, and then I want to ask you. We're going to run a few minutes over, if that's okay with you two guys, because I want to ask you for a biblical response, if we can have a short one, and how we as believers can challenge culture to a different way of thinking. Ron, who do you have from our sponsors coming up?
Well, we are back with World's End Theology Outlet, and they have another wonderful product, of course. Are you still trying to figure out how to clean up in the ministry business? Do you want to finally learn how to get to the bottom of growing a successful church? Would you like to flush away your failures and start having your best church now? Well, then you need Charlatan Ultra Soft. It is personally tested by Joel Osteen. It provides comfort where it counts. It wipes away even the most stubborn orthodoxy. And it comes with a money-back guarantee. Keep those butts in the pews with Charlatan Ultra Soft, which you can get at any time from World's End Theology Outlet. And back to you guys.
Charlatan Ultrasoft. Now, that might make Joel Osteen feel bad. So should that kind of speech be controlled?
Why do you feel bad about being ultra soft? I mean,
being ultra soft. So, Jonathan, Ron, both of you, either one of you, is there a biblical response as we look at a society that, to me, seems like it's in a meltdown mode that says, I don't want to hear conflicting ideas. They might make me feel bad. I don't like the election outcome, and so I need safe spaces, puppy therapy, coloring books.
Well, I would say that what I'm about to say might be counterintuitive. I'm going to say Karl Marx was right. There is an inherent contradiction in every society, but the inherent contradiction isn't caused by what he thinks it's caused by. That is, by class oppression or by the fact that we make class distinctions between people. The inherent contradiction is caused by sin. It's caused, when people say, you were being mean, what they're really saying is you failed to obey the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. You failed to do it either to somebody else or to me. And many times they're right. I mean, I have a lot of fun with these commercials. I'm more than happy to have fun at Joel Osteen's expense. Am I being unloving? Is satire ever unloving? I don't know. Maybe the Lord's going to call me on the carpet for this one day. Right now, I'm going to think maybe not so much. We have satire in the Bible. It's not a totally unknown way of presenting truth, but somewhere there's a line. Okay, somewhere out there is a line where you move from just having fun and staying within the parameters of the two great commandments, love God and love your neighbor, and then somewhere else you go across it. The inherent contradiction is everybody wants to live in the kind of society that we would have if everybody obeyed God, but nobody wants to obey God.
Jonathan, thoughts?
All right. Well, so my first thought when it comes to a biblical response is two things. Critical thinking is part of discipleship, right? Love God with all of your mind. Who wrote Love God with All of Your Mind? Was that J.P. Moreland that wrote that? I think he did. The book Love God with All of Your Mind. And I think that we need critical thinking more than ever, right? I said this the other day on Facebook. I have never felt more burden to get people to think clearly, to use logic and reason, and to think clearly than I ever have before as a result of what's going on right now. The second thing that I would say is that as Christians, there is no room for separatism, whether that comes from either the alt-right or the alt-left, from either radical race theorists or this increasingly vocal but tiny group of alt-right white separatists like Richard Spencer. There's no room for either of those within the Christian church.
You're talking about racial separatism.
I'm thinking of Galatians 3:28, that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And the idea here being that what we are about is creating a new family. And it seems to be a family that transcends both race, gender, even political ideology.
Right.
Bathrooms.
Yeah.
Well,
See,
no, that kind of separation is actually a good thing. Probably.
You really have to be careful, I think, and define your terms. When you say there's no room for separatism, you mean racial separatism or the kind of, or separating Because really, people take these words and they run with them. Well, there's no room for separatism, so now we can have transgender bathrooms, or you know.
Well, I went on to qualify by talking about separatism
Yes.
in terms of race
Yes.
and, you know, these sorts of things.
I agree totally. It is a lot about clear thinking. It is about loving God with your mind. The only way Christians are going to love God with their minds is to renew their minds according to God's word. And I'm afraid that very little of that is going on in the church today.
Okay.
So
So it
many,
brings
Yeah.
me maybe to where I wanted to get to from a church standpoint as an apologist. Because discipleship to me is like really key to this whole question. And that is that the church almost needs to, instead of trying to be more like the world in order to attract unbelievers into somehow multi-level marketing them into the faith, to instead set a biblical agenda for how we live as believers, as a family of God, as Jonathan pointed out, which is distinct and different from how we live in the world. We may have a wealthy individual in the church and someone who works as a janitor and in some complex, but it may be that in the church, the janitor is the one who is the elder because he has the most spiritual maturity and should be, and the wealthy guy, although he may have money, has little spiritual maturity and still needs to sit under the tutelage of the janitor. Would that be a fair way to frame that?
yes.
Yeah,
You know,
that seems right to me.
Yeah. So the church kind of needs to, in my opinion, now there are some churches who are doing this, in all fairness. There are some churches who are doing this, but it seems to me that the church needs to step back and go, wait a minute, what is it that we really are supposed to be doing? Are we supposed to be engaging in bringing about social justice? Is that the task of the church? I don't personally find that in Scripture. What I find is the church's task is to grow disciples, to train them to think critically, to love in an almost unfettered way those others within the church, and to let that love extend out into the community in a way that draws people to come to say, I want what you have. There's something about the way Christians are living that should become both attractive to unbelievers and repelling in some cases to unbelievers, that they don't want to be a part of what it is that we're doing. And that's fine. They should have that right. But instead, it seems like the church is sort of in search of a way to entertain unbelievers, to get them into the doors, to sneak up on them with the gospel, and as a result are no longer influencing culture. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I think that method is kind of falling on hard times. The generation.
Are we seeing the consequences of that method? Right
Yeah, we
now?
are. Well, we are, because what we're seeing now is the generation that was raised in the megachurch is turning its back on the megachurch. The megachurch that entertained its parents and entertained them for so many years. So they start turning their backs on the megachurch, and what are they in search of? They're in search of something more solid than entertainment. This is what you hear time and time again. And you can either turn to the historic roots of the faith and get into some really good theology and biblical studies, or people are finding what they consider to be solid food in the social justice movement. It certainly has more to offer than entertainment. So you have I guess a case in point would be who's the PTL club guy, Jim Baker. He's really still doing his entertainment shtick. I mean, I think he's repented of his former ways of doing things. I think that he's on a better path than he used to be. But, I mean, he's still really doing the same basic routine, only on a smaller level. And his son has gone off into, more into the direction of the social justice arena. It's not, he didn't find his dad's way of doing things very satisfying. So,
guys, you know what? We're about 10 minutes over. We're going to pick up social justice, I think, after the first of the year, because it's something that, in my opinion, we need to address to the church, just as a way to say, how do we rethink the church back to the first century, which lived in a culture not unlike the one we're in today, which ultimately impacted the culture by their behavior, their teaching, their view of the human condition in ways that we are not currently doing that. So anyway, for those reviewing, we're going to pick this up after the first of the year again. In the meantime, Ron, you want to...
yeah, let's give credit where credit is due tonight. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Justin Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage is provided by Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygumus. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage is provided by Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys is O.D. Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are from the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna P. Sami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wire Tapping. Our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, who are solely responsible for its content, although you will never be able to prove that in court.
All right, guys. Thank you. And Ron, we'll be back next week, Lord willing, and technically able.
All right. Take care. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.